The racist judge finds black woman, only to learn she owns the courthouse. Judge William Harrison's courtroom had seen thousands of cases over his 20-year career, but none would be remembered quite like this one. In just 20 minutes, his carefully constructed world of privilege and power would shatter like the gaveled silence he so proudly maintained. On this crisp October morning, the Jefferson County Courthouse stood as it always had, an imposing limestone monument to justice, its marble floors gleaming under fluorescent lights, its high ceilings echoing with the footsteps of the powerful and powerless alike. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers, adjusting his black robes with practiced precision, reviewing his morning docket with the cursory glance of someone who had already decided most cases before hearing them. Case number 247 seemed unremarkable, a simple parking violation. The defendant's name, Sarah Bennett, meant nothing to him. Just another citizen who would learn the price of disrespecting his authority. He couldn't know that this particular defendant owned not just the ground beneath his feet, but half the commercial real estate in Jefferson County. He couldn't see that the woman in simple jeans and a white shirt, clutching photos of a broken parking meter, had spent the morning inspecting her latest acquisition, this very courthouse. As Judge Harrison prepared to dispense his particular brand of justice, he remained blissfully unaware that his next ruling would trigger an investigation into years of biased decisions, expose systemic prejudices that had festered unchecked, and ultimately transform the entire Jefferson County legal system. The security cameras would capture every moment of his downfall, his arrogance preserved in high definition for future judicial training sessions. In 15 minutes, Sarah Bennett would walk into courtroom 3B, and Judge William Harrison's world would change forever. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest cases, and justice, like karma, has a way of demanding its due. Share your story of witnessing justice, or injustice, in the comments below. Has a small moment ever led to big change in your community? Sarah Bennett's day began like any other, with the gentle chirp of her 5 a.m. alarm in her modest 3-bedroom ranch house on the outskirts of Jefferson County. The early morning darkness pressed against her windows as she laced up her running shoes, her mother's words echoing in her mind. True wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you give back. Those words had shaped Sarah's entire approach to building her real estate empire. At 35, she controlled half the commercial properties in downtown Jefferson, yet few people knew her face. She preferred it that way. Success, in her experience, worked best when it walked softly. The pre-dawn air carried a crisp October chill as Sarah completed her daily 5-mile run. Back home, she showered quickly and dressed in her standard work attire, comfortable jeans, a plain white button-down shirt, and well-worn walking shoes. Her closet held designer suits and elegant dresses, but those rarely saw daylight. Property inspections required practical clothing, and Sarah believed in doing the work herself. Over a breakfast of black coffee and whole-grain toast, she reviewed her schedule on her tablet. 3 building inspections before noon, a meeting with the county commissioner at 2, and somewhere in between, she needed to handle that parking ticket situation. Sarah smiled slightly at the irony. The owner of half of downtown Jefferson fighting a $50 parking fine. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael, her assistant of 7 years and one of the few people who knew the true extent of her holdings. Renovation plans for the courthouse are ready for review. Also, maintenance reports confirm that meter on Oak Street has been malfunctioning for weeks. Sarah's modest home office told its own story about her character. The walls held no fancy degrees or awards, though she had plenty. Instead, framed photographs showed before and after shots of buildings she'd renovated, a crumbling downtown theater transformed into a community arts center, an abandoned warehouse converted into affordable housing. Each project represented not just a business investment, but a step toward improving Jefferson County. Her mother's influence was evident in every aspect of her life. Catherine Bennett had raised Sarah alone after her father's death, working as a high school teacher while slowly building a small real estate portfolio. Property is more than just buildings, she'd taught Sarah. It's about creating spaces where communities can thrive. When Catherine passed away 5 years ago, she left Sarah not just her properties, but a vision of what responsible wealth could accomplish. Standing at her kitchen window, Sarah watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her neighbors were starting to stir, the Rogers family next door piling into their minivan for the school run, Mr. Chin across the street walking his golden retriever. None of them knew that the unassuming woman in the ranch house owned the office buildings where they worked, the shops where they bought groceries, or as of last week, the very courthouse where Sarah would soon appear for her parking ticket hearing. She gathered her documentation, photographs of the broken meter, maintenance reports, and previous dismissed citations, into a simple manila folder. In her line of work, Sarah had learned that preparation mattered more than presentation. Her phone buzzed again with another text from Michael. Judge Harrison's courtroom, 10 a.m. You should know his reputation. Sarah already knew about Judge William Harrison. His pattern of biased rulings was one of the reasons she'd been interested in acquiring the courthouse building. Sometimes, change needed to come from within the system itself. As she pulled on her jacket and picked up her car keys, Sarah couldn't help but smile at what lay ahead. Today might start with a parking ticket, but it could end with something much more significant. Let me ask you, have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes, looking ordinary can be your greatest advantage. The Jefferson County Courthouse cast long shadows across the parking lot as Sarah pulled into a space at precisely 9:15 a.m. Through the windshield, she studied the limestone facade she now owned, noting the ways time had weathered the classical columns. The building needed work, the gutters were rusting, the steps showed wear, and the windows desperately needed updating. But beneath the decay lay something solid, something worth saving. Inside, the air conditioning hit her face with an artificial blast of cold. The metal detectors beeped steadily as a stream of people passed through, lawyers in press suits, defendants in their Sunday best, court staff with ID badges swinging from lanyards. Sarah joined the line, observing how the security guards treated different people differently. A well-dressed attorney was waved through with barely a glance. The Hispanic family in front of Sarah received a much more thorough inspection. Arms out, please, the guard instructed Sarah, his eyes skimming over her casual attire with subtle dismissal. She complied, hiding her amusement. The deed to this building was probably still sitting on someone's desk in the county clerk's office, waiting to be processed. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, reflecting the hurried footsteps of justice in motion. Sarah checked the notice again. Courtroom 3B, Judge William Harrison presiding. She had 40 minutes before her hearing. Plenty of time to observe. Outside Courtroom 3B, wooden benches lined the walls, filled with people waiting their turn. Sarah found a spot between a young mother struggling with a crying baby and an elderly man nervously shuffling through dog-eared papers. The air felt heavy with anxiety, thick with the kind of tension that came from ordinary people facing a system they didn't quite understand. First time here? The elderly man asked, his hands trembling slightly as he organized his documents. Something like that, Sarah replied, pulling out her phone to review the photos of the broken meter one more time. The evidence was clear. The meter had been malfunctioning for weeks, and she wasn't the only one affected. A young clerk hurried past, arms full of files. She paused briefly at the sight of the crying baby, her face softening with sympathy. If you're here for Judge Harrison, she whispered to the young mother, try to keep the baby quiet. He's not very patient with disruptions. Sarah watched the mother's face tighten with worry. The baby, sensing tension, cried harder. Without hesitation, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small stuffed elephant she kept for her niece's visits. Here, she offered. This might help. The mother's grateful smile was interrupted by the bailiff's booming voice. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison. The courtroom doors swung open, and a ripple of movement went through the waiting crowd. People straightened their clothes, checked their papers one last time, and tried to make themselves as presentable as possible. Sarah observed it all, noting how fear could manifest in such small gestures. Judge Harrison strode down the hallway, his black robes billowing slightly. He was tall, with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile. He didn't acknowledge the people waiting outside his courtroom, didn't see how they shrank back as he passed. Power, Sarah knew, revealed itself most clearly in how others reacted to its presence. Inside the courtroom, Sarah chose a seat near the back, settling in to watch the proceedings before her case was called. The room itself spoke of faded grandeur, high ceilings with ornate moldings, dark wood paneling, and large windows that filtered the morning light through years of accumulated grime. Another item for her renovation list. The first few cases set a clear pattern. Judge Harrison was remarkably patient with certain defendants. The well-dressed white college student who'd been caught speeding received understanding nods and a reduced fine. The next case, involving a middle-aged black woman who'd failed to update her vehicle registration, earned sharp reprimands and the maximum penalty. Sarah noticed the court reporter's fingers hesitate over her keyboard during particularly harsh exchanges. The young clerk from earlier, whose nameplate read, Amy, kept shooting apologetic glances at defendants as she handled their paperwork. Even the bailiff seemed uncomfortable with some of the judge's rulings. Throughout it all, Sarah took notes on her phone, documenting times, reactions, and discrepancies in treatment. As a business owner, she'd learned that change required more than just good intentions. It required evidence, patterns, proof. Case number 247, Sarah Bennett, parking violation. Amy called out, her voice carrying a slight tremor. Sarah stood, straightening her simple white shirt. As she walked to the podium, she felt Judge Harrison's gaze sweep over her, taking in her casual clothes and practical shoes. His lips tightened almost imperceptibly, another data point in her growing collection of observations. Miss Bennett, he said, drawing out her name with the faintest hint of condescension. You're here for a parking violation on Oak Street, dated October 15th. He shuffled through her file without really looking at it, his tone suggesting he'd already decided the outcome. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied politely, laying her documentation on the podium. I have evidence that the meter was malfunctioning that day. Several other people had the same. Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades on the bench. The citation clearly states that your meter expired at 2:15 p.m. Are you suggesting our city's equipment is faulty? The courtroom had grown silent, the kind of silence that came from people holding their breath, recognizing the familiar signs of approaching storm. Sarah could feel Amy's worried gaze, see the court reporter's fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard. The young mother with the baby had slipped into the back row, clutching the borrowed elephant like a talisman. Your Honor, if you'll just look at these photos. I've heard enough excuses today. Judge Harrison cut her off again, his voice carrying a tone that many in the courtroom recognized. He had already made up his mind. What Judge Harrison didn't know, as he sat high on his bench looking down at Sarah Bennett in her simple clothes, was that this particular case would soon become the talk of Jefferson County. He had no idea that the quiet woman standing before him owned not just this building but also the ground it stood on. Sarah stood calmly, waiting for what would come next. Years of business negotiations had taught her patience. Sometimes, she knew, you had to let things play out to create real change. Have you ever witnessed unfair treatment in a place of authority? Share your experience in the comments below. What did you do? What do you wish you had done? Miss Bennett, Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tense silence of courtroom 3B. This is your 3rd parking violation this year. He looked down at her with barely concealed disdain, not knowing that the other tickets had already been dismissed when Sarah proved the same meter was malfunctioning. Actually, Your Honor, Sarah spoke carefully, her voice steady despite the growing tension. Those previous citations were dismissed because... Did I give you permission to speak? Judge Harrison's face flushed slightly red. He turned to his clerk. Amy, show me Ms. Bennett's record. The young clerk hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled up the records on her computer. Sir, the previous citations were... Her voice trailed off as Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. Never mind that, he snapped. Miss Bennett, your continuous disregard for our city's parking laws shows a pattern of disrespect for authority. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The court reporter's fingers had stopped moving entirely, her eyes fixed on her screen in disbelief. Sarah stood straight and dignified. She was used to being underestimated in business meetings, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment in this courtroom. She noticed the young mother in the back clutching the borrowed stuffed elephant, watching with wide eyes. The elderly man from the hallway had slipped in and was shaking his head slowly. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, shuffling papers on his desk, your casual attitude today shows a lack of respect for this court. He glanced disapprovingly at her jeans and comfortable work shirt, not knowing she had already inspected 3 building sites that morning. The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. The deed to the courthouse building was probably still being processed in the county clerk's office. The air conditioning hummed steadily, a counterpoint to the mounting tension. Through the dusty windows, Sarah could see clouds gathering outside, as if nature itself was responding to the atmosphere in the courtroom. She remained silent, years of business experience telling her that sometimes the most powerful move was to let someone reveal their own prejudices. Given your history and attitude, Judge Harrison declared, clearly enjoying his moment of authority, I am imposing a fine of $5,000. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Even the bailiff's professional mask slipped for a moment, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. Amy, the clerk, accidentally knocked over a stack of files, the sound of papers hitting the floor eerily loud in the shocked silence. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice remaining steady despite her growing anger. I would like to appeal this decision. Judge Harrison smiled coldly. You have that right, of course. But be aware that filing an appeal will add court costs to your fine. Now, do you have anything else to say before we conclude this matter? Sarah looked around the courtroom. She saw the worried faces of other people waiting for their cases to be heard. She saw the court reporter who had stopped typing and was staring at her computer screen in disbelief. She saw Amy biting her lip nervously, a pile of scattered papers at her feet. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied quietly. I believe everything that needs to be said will come out soon enough. Judge Harrison missed the subtle meaning in her words. He was already reaching for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. Very well. Pay the fine within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case. As Sarah turned to leave, she caught Amy's eye. The young clerk mouthed, I'm sorry, when Judge Harrison wasn't looking. Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile. Walking out of the courtroom, she pulled out her phone and checked the time. Her meeting with County Commissioner James Thompson was in exactly 1 hour, a meeting about renovation plans for this very courthouse. The young mother hurried after her into the hallway. Here's your elephant back, she said softly. I'm so sorry about what happened in there. $5,000 for a parking ticket, it's insane. Sarah accepted the stuffed toy with a gentle smile. Sometimes, she said quietly, justice works in unexpected ways. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. If you ever need help with your case, call this number. Things around here are about to change. In his chambers, Judge Harrison was already congratulating himself on maintaining order in his courtroom. He didn't notice Amy lingering in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper she just received from the county clerk's office, a document that would turn his world upside down. Sarah walked down the courthouse steps, the unfair fine notice clutched in her hand. The gathering clouds had finally burst, and a light rain was falling. She smiled as she remembered another lesson from her mother. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest injustices. What would you do if you witnessed such an abuse of power? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between speaking up immediately or waiting for the right moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sarah sat in Commissioner Thompson's office, architectural plans spread across his mahogany desk. Sunlight streamed through the top-floor windows, highlighting the detailed blueprints for the courthouse renovation. Michael, her assistant, stood quietly by her side, holding additional folders of documentation. These improvements are exactly what we need, Commissioner Thompson said, examining the plans with evident excitement. The new technology upgrades for the courtrooms alone will bring us into the 21st century. Though I must say, Ms. Bennett, I'm surprised you're starting with Courtroom 3B. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Come in, Thompson called out. Judge William Harrison strode into the office, his black robes swishing importantly. Commissioner, you wanted to see me about the renovations. He stopped dead in his tracks as he saw Sarah sitting there, her simple white shirt and jeans now a stark contrast to the elaborate plans spread before her. Ah, Judge Harrison! Thompson rose from his chair, beaming. Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Ms. Bennett properly. She's the new owner of the courthouse building. She's planning some wonderful improvements to your courtroom. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Sarah turned to face him, her expression professionally composed. Judge Harrison and I have already met, she said calmly. In fact, he just fined me $5,000 for a parking violation at a meter that maintenance records show has been broken for months. Commissioner Thompson's eyebrows shot up. $5,000 for a parking ticket? Yes, Sarah continued, her voice steady. It was quite an interesting experience seeing how justice is administered in the courthouse I now own. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the usual sounds of the building seemed muted, as if the courthouse itself was holding its breath. Judge Harrison's face had gone from pale to ashen. His hands, usually so steady with the gavel, trembled slightly at his sides. I didn't know, he stammered, his earlier arrogance evaporating like morning dew. That's exactly the point, Your Honor, Sarah replied, turning back to the blueprints. You didn't know who I was, so you felt free to treat me with contempt. Just like you didn't know the young mother in your courtroom this morning was struggling with a sick child, or that the elderly man with trembling hands was a veteran trying to explain a simple mistake. Michael stepped forward, opening one of his folders. Commissioner Thompson, these are the maintenance records for the parking meter in question. We've also compiled data on similar incidents over the past year. Judge Harrison sank into a chair, his robes pooling around him like a deflating balloon. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the air in the room felt different. I believe, Sarah continued, pointing to a section of the blueprints, that Courtroom 3B will be the first to receive renovations. We'll need to temporarily relocate those proceedings during construction, of course. She paused, looking directly at Judge Harrison. Though perhaps this would be a good opportunity for some other kinds of renovation as well. Commissioner Thompson cleared his throat. Judge Harrison, I think we need to discuss this $5,000 fine. And perhaps review some of your other recent decisions. Through the office windows, Sarah could see the courthouse square below, where people went about their business, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in the power structure above them. She thought about Amy the clerk, the court reporter, and all the others who had witnessed countless similar incidents, but felt powerless to speak up. Your Honor, she said, turning back to Judge Harrison, I've learned in business that true power isn't about making people feel small. It's about lifting people up, about creating systems that serve everyone equally. She gestured to the blueprints. These renovations aren't just about updating the building. They're about updating how justice is served within these walls. Judge Harrison sat there, 20 years of unchecked authority crumbling around him like the courthouse's aging facade. In just a few minutes, his world had turned upside down, and he knew this was only the beginning. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true identity or power was revealed? How did it change the dynamics of the situation? Share your story in the comments below. By sunset, the news had spread through the Jefferson County Courthouse like wildfire. The story grew with each retelling: how Judge Harrison had excessively fined the very woman who owned the building, how his years of biased rulings were finally coming to light. The marble halls buzzed with whispered conversations and hurried phone calls. In her downtown office, Sarah sat surrounded by mounting evidence. Amy, the court clerk, had brought boxes of files documenting Judge Harrison's previous cases. She'd been keeping detailed notes for months, tracking patterns she'd been too afraid to report. Look at this one, Amy said, pulling out a file. Last month, A white college student got community service for the same offense that sent a black teenager to juvenile detention for 6 months. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, years of silent observation finally finding voice. Michael, Sarah's assistant, was compiling the data into clear statistical analyses. "The numbers are staggering," he reported, turning his laptop screen to show her. "On average, minorities receive fines 200% higher than white defendants for identical violations. The disparity in sentencing is even worse." The court reporter had provided official transcripts, while security footage captured the subtle expressions, tones, and body language that never made it into written records. Sarah watched clips of Judge Harrison's varying treatment of defendants, each video adding another piece to the puzzle. Local civil rights organizations began calling as word spread. "We've heard complaints about Judge Harrison for years," said Marcus Washington, director of the Jefferson County Justice Initiative. "But nobody had enough power to challenge him. Until now." Outside Sarah's office window, she could see news vans gathering in front of the courthouse. The Jefferson Daily News had already posted their first online story. "Local judge under investigation, pattern of bias exposed." Chief Judge Martinez, Harrison's supervisor, called an emergency meeting of the Judicial Review Board. "This goes beyond one parking ticket," he told the assembled judges. "We're looking at potential civil rights violations spanning decades." In his chambers, Judge Harrison sat alone, watching his carefully constructed world crumble. His computer screen displayed email after email from reporters seeking comment. On his desk lay printouts of his own cases, the pattern of bias now glaringly obvious in black and white. Sarah received another visitor that evening, Rachel Harrison, the judge's daughter and a law student at the state university. "My professor used one of my father's cases as an example of judicial bias today," she said quietly. "I didn't even recognize his patterns until now." The investigation expanded beyond Judge Harrison. Other court employees began coming forward, sharing similar stories of systemic bias they'd witnessed. The courthouse maintenance staff provided records showing how broken meters were reported but never fixed, disproportionately affecting certain neighborhoods. Sarah worked late into the night, reviewing security footage with her legal team. "It's not just about exposing one judge's bias," she explained. "It's about showing how these systems perpetuate inequality. The building itself needs renovation, but so does the justice system operating within it." Social media picked up the story. #JeffersonJustice began trending locally as people shared their own experiences with biased treatment in the courthouse. Local community leaders called for a complete audit of the county's judicial system. Commissioner Thompson called Sarah again. "The Judicial Review Board wants to meet tomorrow morning," he said. "They're requesting your presence and all your evidence." In preparation for the meeting, Sarah gathered her materials, statistical analyses, video footage, transcripts, maintenance records, and dozens of personal testimonies. But her most powerful evidence was something simpler: her own experience of being judged not by the facts of her case, but by her appearance and perceived status. As midnight approached, she stood at her office window, looking out at the courthouse. The building's facade was lit by the news van's lights, its shadows highlighting the cracks in its foundation, both literal and metaphorical. Tomorrow would bring either the beginning of real change or the continuation of business as usual. Everything depended on how the justice system responded to having its own flaws exposed. Have you ever been part of exposing systemic injustice? What gave you the courage to speak up? Share your experience in the comments below.